was May 14th, 1976, in Oklahoma. Layla Johnston is 68 years old. She has just retired from the Oklahoma Department of Human Services, where she spent her career working in welfare services, helping families, helping children, doing the quiet, essential work of a public servant who shows up every day for people who need someone to show up. She has just retired. She is at the beginning of the part of her life that is supposed to be hers. A neighbor comes to check on her. The door is unlocked. The neighbor goes in. Layla Johnston is inside. She has been raped and strangled. Someone came into her home and killed her, and no one heard anything, and no one saw anyone leaving. And when investigators arrive, they collect what evidence they can and begin the work of finding who did this. In 1976, DNA technology does not exist. The evidence is collected and stored. The investigation produces suspects, leads, possibilities, none of them strong enough to result in an arrest. The trail goes cold the way cold case trails go cold, not with a dramatic dead end, but with a gradual thinning of possibilities until the active investigation becomes a file in a cabinet, something that investigators carry as unfinished business but cannot move forward. Layla Johnston's family carries it differently. Her granddaughter Leslie grows up knowing what happened to her grandmother, knowing that someone killed her, and that the someone has never been held responsible. Growing up with that knowledge is a particular kind of inheritance, an open question that arrives with the family history and does not fully close. She does not get to have a grandmother who died of old age at the end of a long life in the ordinary way. She gets a grandmother who was killed, and an investigation that went cold, and a name that took 48 years to arrive. Leslie gives interviews over the years. She says she had begun to believe it would never be resolved. She had been living with the question for decades. Decades pass. The evidence from 1976 sits in storage. Biological material collected from the crime scene, preserved through 50 years of temperature changes and storage conditions, and the ordinary entropy that time applies to everything. It waits. The family does not stop asking. Leslie asks. She contacts cold case units. She asks what the status of the case is, whether new technology might be applied, whether there is anything she can do to keep her grandmother's case from permanently disappearing into the system. She is told that the case is open. She is told investigators are committed to cold cases. She waits. For decades, waiting is all there is. Forensic genealogy changes what is possible. In the years after the technique is used to identify the Golden State Killer, Joseph James DeAngelo, caught in 2018 after decades of evading investigation, law enforcement agencies across the country begin applying the same approach to their own cold cases. The method works by extracting DNA from evidence, building a genetic profile, and searching public genealogy databases for relatives who share enough genetic material to trace the family tree toward a suspect. In 2023, investigators apply forensic genealogy to the evidence from Layla Johnston's case. They build a family tree. They follow it. It leads to a man named Charles Droke. Droke had been in Oklahoma in 1976. He was the right age, the right profile, a person who could have come to Layla Johnston's door for reasons that made her open it. The evidence matches. The genetic connection is established. But Charles Droke is dead. His own brother killed him in 1989. A separate act of violence in a separate context, for separate reasons. Charles Droke died 4 years before DNA testing even became a standard part of criminal investigation. He died before forensic genealogy existed. He died never having been questioned about what happened to Layla Johnston on May 14th, 1976. He is gone. He cannot be charged. He cannot be tried. He cannot be made to stand in a courtroom in Oklahoma and answer for what he did to a 68-year-old retired woman who had spent her career helping other people and was killed in her own home in the first week of her retirement. He will never answer for it. That is the specific grief of a case resolved this way. The name arrives, the identification is made, the question is answered, and there is nowhere to put the answer. No courtroom, no sentencing, no moment of reckoning. Just a name attached to a dead man, and the knowledge that he got away with it for 48 years because he died before the technology existed to find him. Leslie Johnston hears the news in 2023, 48 years after her grandmother was killed. 48 years of carrying the open question, of believing it might never be resolved. She says, "I thought this would never end. It has ended. Not with justice, not with an arrest, a trial, a conviction, the full accounting that Layla Johnston deserved, but with an answer, with a name. With the knowledge that the person who killed her grandmother has been identified, even if the identification came decades after it could have made any legal difference. 48 years. Layla Johnston retired to start the part of her life that was supposed to be hers. She had 1 week of it. Her granddaughter waited 48 years for a name. The name arrived. Too late for anything but knowing, and knowing matters. Leslie Johnston says it matters. 48 years of not knowing, of carrying an open question through a life, through decades, through the moments when she had almost stopped believing an answer would come. And then the answer comes. It is not nothing. It is not justice. It is the name of the man who killed her grandmother. It is, after 48 years, at least that much. Layla Johnston is buried in Oklahoma. She retired on a Friday. She was killed on a Monday. She had 3 days of the life she had earned. Her family has spent 48 years making sure she was not forgotten. She was not forgotten. The DNA found her killer. His death could not protect him from that. How did this story hit you? Drop it in the comments. Subscribe to Hollow Fears to unlock the next file. It was February 9th, 1979, in Banning, California, 85 miles east of Los Angeles. Esther Gonzalez is 17 years old. She is walking from her house to her sister's house. It is not a long distance. It is the kind of walk a 17-year-old takes without thinking about it. A familiar route, a known destination, the short trip between one family member's home and another's. She does not arrive. The next morning, her body is found along Highway 243. She has been attacked and killed. She is in the snowpack on the side of the road, the winter roadside where snow accumulates along the edge of the pavement, cold and gray and ordinary in the way that highway shoulders are ordinary. She is 17 years old, and she is in the snow on a California highway, and her sister is waiting for her. Investigators come. Evidence is collected. The area around Highway 243 is searched. People who may have seen something are interviewed. The investigation produces a name, a suspect, a man whose path intersects with the evidence in ways that make him a person of interest. He takes a polygraph test. In 1979, the polygraph is considered a meaningful investigative tool. It is not admissible as evidence in most courts, but it shapes the direction of an investigation. A person who passes is typically no longer the focus. The examiner administers the test. The results are reviewed. He passes. He is released. He moves on with his life. He builds whatever life he builds in the years after 1979. A life in which he took a polygraph test and passed and walked away from an investigation into the killing of a 17-year-old girl and was never charged. The case goes cold. The investigators move to other cases. The file stays open in the technical sense. A missing persons case, a homicide, something that is never officially closed. But the active investigation stops advancing. There are no new leads. The suspect passed his test, and the evidence does not produce another name. Esther's sister, Elizabeth, carries it. The way siblings carry these things, not loudly, not always visibly, but constantly, in the permanent way that the loss of someone to violence becomes part of the interior architecture of a person's life. Elizabeth grows older. She raises children, maybe, builds a life, does the ordinary things of living. And underneath all of it, the question, who killed her sister on that road in 1979? 45 years pass. Elizabeth gives interviews sometimes, over the years. She talks about Esther, about who she was at 17, about what the family lost, about the walk that was supposed to be a short trip between two houses and became something else. She does not stop talking about it. She does not stop believing that somewhere, in the evidence from 1979, there is something that will eventually tell her who did this to her sister. She is right. The evidence from 1979 sits in storage in California. Biological material collected and preserved, aging through 4.5 decades of storage conditions. It waits. Forensic genealogy arrives. Riverside County investigators apply the technique to Esther's case, the same approach that has resolved other long cold cases. Extract DNA from the evidence, build a genetic profile, search public genealogy databases for relatives, trace the family tree toward a suspect. The tree leads to Louis Randy Williamson. Williamson had been the suspect in 1979. The man who took the polygraph test and passed. The man who walked away. He died in 2014. He died 10 years before the technology that would have caught him was applied to Esther's case. He died at 74 years old, of natural causes presumably, having spent 45 years alive in a world where the girl he killed was in a grave, and her family had no answer. He knew what he had done. He sat in that room and answered the questions, and the machine measured his responses, and the examiner reviewed the results and said he passed. He knew what the correct answers were. He knew what had happened on Highway 243 in 1979, and the polygraph, which measures physiological responses to stress, did not catch the specific way he managed that knowledge. He took the test, knowing what he had done, and he passed it, and he left. He lived for 35 more years. He watched Esther's case go cold. He watched the years pass. He watched DNA technology develop, watched forensic genealogy become something that law enforcement began applying to old evidence. He reached 74 years old. He died in 2014, thinking he had escaped. Elizabeth Gonzalez hears the news in 2024. Her sister has been dead for 45 years. The man who killed her has been dead for 10. She says, "We are happy that we finally know. But these years, that phrase contains everything. The 45 years of not knowing, of carrying the question, of watching the investigation go cold and stay cold. The years of Elizabeth's life lived in the shadow of a highway in 1979. The years that Esther never got. The years that should have been hers after 17. The life that was taken from her in the snow on the side of the road. But these years. Esther Gonzalez is buried in California. She was 17 years old. She was walking to her sister's house. Louis Randy Williamson passed a polygraph in 1979 and lived for another 35 years. The DNA found him in 2024. He had been dead for 10 years by then. He thought he had escaped. He hadn't. It just took a long time for the truth to catch up. The polygraph said he was telling the truth. The DNA said he wasn't. The DNA was right. Esther Gonzalez was 17 years old. She was walking to her sister's house on a February evening in California, in the cold, on a road she had probably walked before. Elizabeth waited 45 years. The answer came. Not in time for a trial, not in time for a conviction, not in time for any of the things that the word justice implies, but in time for Elizabeth to know. In time for Esther's name to be attached to an answer. That is what 45 years of waiting produced. A name. A dead man. A truth that arrived too late for the law and just barely in time for the family. It had to be enough. It is what there is. How did this story hit you? Drop it in the comments. And subscribe to Hollow Fears to unlock the next file. We are a brand new channel, so we really need your support. Stick around and make sure to subscribe. It was 1980 on a highway in Idaho. A woman's body is found in the tall grass beside the road. She has been murdered, and no one knows her name. Not at first. Not for a long time. The investigators who come to the scene document what they find. A woman, adult, cause of death determined. They collect evidence. They take photographs. They do the careful work of a homicide investigation. They do not know who she is. No one has reported a woman matching her description as missing. No one comes forward to identify her. She exists in the case files as a Jane Doe, a woman who was killed on an Idaho highway and whose name is not known to the people working to find out what happened to her. Eventually, she is identified. Her name is Mary Tracy. How she came to be on that highway, where she was coming from, where she was going. The investigation assembles what it can. She had a life. She had people who knew her. The circumstances that put her on that road are part of the case, part of the story, something that investigators piece together in the way investigators piece together the stories of victims who cannot tell them directly. A suspect is identified. A man whose path intersects with the evidence in ways that place him in the context of what happened to Mary Tracy. He is a person of interest. He is investigated. He is not charged. The evidence is not enough. Or the case is not built the right way. Or the specific legal threshold required to charge someone with murder in Idaho in 1980 is not met by what investigators have. The suspect walks away. The case stays open. Think about what the original investigators knew and could not use. They had evidence. They had a suspect. They had a case that pointed in a direction. But pointing in a direction in 1980, with the technology and the legal standards of 1980, is not the same as proving it. The gap between what investigators believe and what they can prove in court is where cases go cold and stay cold. The suspect walked away because because the gap was too wide. The evidence waited, and then the years pass in the way that years pass in cold cases. With the file sitting in storage, with the investigator who built the case retiring, with the original detectives dying, with the physical evidence aging in the evidence room, and the specific institutional knowledge of what was gathered and how walking out of the department with the people who gathered it. Decades. Mary Tracy's family does not stop caring about what happened to her. Families of murder victims rarely do. The open case is a permanent presence in their lives, something they carry into every ordinary day. At some point, decades after 1980, members of Mary Tracy's family contact the relevant authorities and ask about the case. They push for a review. They ask whether new technology might be applied. In 2023, the case is formally reopened. In 2024, forensic genealogy is applied to the biological evidence collected from the crime scene in 1980. The DNA has survived. Stored correctly, preserved through the decades, the genetic material that was collected from that highway in Idaho has waited 44 years to be read by technology that did not exist when it was gathered. The family tree that grows from the evidence leads to a man named Charles Nicholas Strain. Strain is the original suspect. The man who was investigated in the early 1980s and not charged. The man who walked away from the investigation and built whatever life he built afterward. He died in 2007 in prison. He had been incarcerated for other crimes, other things he did in the years after Mary Tracy was killed on that Idaho highway. Other violence that the legal system was able to prove. He was convicted of those things, and he went to prison for them, and he died there in 2007. He died in prison for something else. He was never charged with killing Mary Tracy. He knew what he had done. He knew that the evidence from 1980 was in a storage room somewhere, that it was aging, that the technology to read it properly did not exist yet. He had walked away from that investigation 40 years before he died. He believed he was safe. He died in a cell, serving time for something else, never having been charged with killing Mary Tracy. He is dead. He cannot be charged now, but his name is in the case file. His DNA is matched to the evidence. His connection to what happened on that Idaho highway in 1980 is now documented, established, official. He is named. There is something specific about this pattern, about the cases where the killer dies before the identification is made, that sits differently than the cases where a living person is arrested and charged. When a living person is arrested, there is a trial, a verdict, a moment of reckoning. The family sits in a courtroom and watches someone answer for what they did. When the killer is dead, there is only the name, the match, the file that gets updated with a new entry. There is no trial. There is no moment of confrontation. There is just the knowledge, arriving decades later, that the person who did this has already died without ever being held fully accountable. The family gets the answer. They do not get the trial. The killers keep dying before the technology catches up to them. They live their lives, Strain living long enough to go to prison for other things, dying there. And they take what they know with them, and then the DNA finds them anyway. It finds them in their absence. It names them after they cannot deny it. It gives the families the answer that the legal system was unable to produce while everyone was still alive. Mary Tracy's family asked for her case to be reopened. They were right to ask. The DNA found the answer. The answer was 44 years late. It arrived anyway. This is what forensic genealogy does. It does not care how long ago something happened. It does not care if the suspect is alive or dead, young or old, convicted of other things or free. It reads the evidence, and it builds the tree, and it finds the name. Charles Nicholas Strain died in 2007 thinking he had gotten away with it. He hadn't. The technology was coming. It just needed 44 more years. Mary Tracy deserved better than a 44-year wait. Her family deserved better. The answer came. It is the only justice there is. How did these 3 stories hit you? Drop a comment below and tell us, what kind of cases do you want to hear next? If you're still here, subscribe to Hollow Fears. New cases every day.